The photograph slipped out of the envelope and landed face up on the concrete floor of my father's garage. And for a moment, I couldn't make my hand reach down and pick it up. My wife, in a parking lot I didn't recognize, handing an envelope to a man I'd never seen. Behind her, my father's handwriting on a torn scrap of paper. "Danny, don't tell her you found this." My father had been dead 3 weeks, and somehow, from the grave, he was trying to warn me about something I hadn't even known to be afraid of. I want to back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what that garage meant to me. My father, Walter Cole, built our family supply company out of a 2-bay warehouse and a used flatbed truck back in 1987. He worked until he physically couldn't anymore, and even then, he'd drive out to the yard twice a week just to look at the inventory, just to feel useful. He died on a Tuesday in April, quietly in his sleep. The kind of death you're supposed to be grateful for, and somehow never are. I'd spent the 3 weeks since the funeral doing what you do, signing papers, thanking neighbors for casseroles, and finally, that Saturday, clearing out his garage because somebody had to. And I wasn't ready to let my wife hire someone to do it. The garage smelled the way it always had. Motor oil, sawdust, the particular mustiness of a workspace nobody had updated since the Reagan administration. I worked through the obvious stuff first. Tools I recognized from childhood. A coffee can of mismatched screws. A stack of yellowed invoices from a supplier that had gone out of business before I graduated high school. I was almost done, ready to call it a day, when I noticed the pegboard on the back wall sat about 2 inches off the studs, just slightly crooked. My father never left anything crooked in his life. I pulled it away from the wall, and behind it was a small fireproof safe bolted straight into the concrete slab, the kind of installation that takes real intention. Not something a man does on a whim, something he plans. I sat on an overturned bucket and stared at it for a long time before I even tried the dial. I don't know why. Maybe some part of me already understood that whatever was inside was going to rearrange something in my life, and I wanted one more minute of not knowing. The combination, when I finally guessed it, my mother's birthday, the woman he'd loved and lost 15 years earlier, clicked open on the 3rd try. Inside, a thin stack of photographs, a manila folder, and a business card, cream-colored, plain, with a name I didn't recognize. Teresa Voss, Private Investigations. Underneath it, my father's handwriting again, smaller this time, more careful, like he'd wanted to be sure I could read it. "Danny, don't tell her you found this." I picked up the photographs first. My wife, Rachel. 21 years of marriage, a woman I would have sworn on anything I owned was as loyal as sunrise. Standing in a parking lot outside a strip mall on the east side of town, handing a manila envelope to a man in a gray sedan. Another photo, different day, same man, this time in a coffee shop, heads bent close over paperwork. A third, Rachel alone, checking her phone, glancing over her shoulder like she was making sure no one she knew could see her. The most recent photo had a date stamped in the corner in faded ink. 9 days before my father died. 9 days. He'd been documenting this until almost the very end of his life. Sick, tired, running out of time, and still, making sure there was proof of something he never once mentioned to me. I sat there on that bucket in my father's garage, the concrete cold through my jeans even in April, holding evidence of something I didn't understand yet. And I felt the specific, hollowing fear of a man who realizes the ground he's been standing on for 21 years was never as solid as he thought. I reached back into the safe. There was one more thing at the bottom, tucked beneath where the photographs had been resting. A second business card, and beneath it, in my father's tightest, most deliberate handwriting, 4 more words that would not let me sleep that night. Call her before Rachel finds out. I didn't call the number that night. I told myself it was too late for any investigator to answer, but the truth is I needed a few hours to sit with the version of my life I thought I'd been living before I let anyone else confirm it wasn't real. I drove home with the safe's contents locked in my glove box, like they might combust if I left them anywhere Rachel could find them. She was already asleep when I got in, a paperback open face down on her chest. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her breathe, trying to reconcile the woman 6 feet away from me with the woman in those photographs. I didn't sleep much. Instead, I found myself doing what 3 weeks of grief hadn't let me do, really thinking about my father. Walter Cole wasn't a warm man in the way people usually mean that. He didn't hug easily or say, "I love you," often. He showed you where you stood by what he trusted you with. He'd handed me the company slowly, over years, always with some small qualifier attached. "Keep your name on everything, son. Always your name." I used to think that was just old business paranoia, residue from a partner who'd burned him early in his career. I never asked him to explain it further. I wish I had. I remembered a dinner about 1.5 years ago, Rachel in the kitchen getting dessert, my father across the table from me saying, out of nowhere, "You ever think about separating your name from hers on the business accounts? Just to keep things clean." I'd laughed it off, told him Rachel had no interest in the company at all. He hadn't laughed with me. He'd just nodded slowly, the way he did when he'd decided not to argue a point he still believed. Other moments were rearranging themselves now into something with a shape. Rachel, over the past year, gently and persistently raising the idea of being added as co-signer on the business accounts. "Just in case something happens to you, Danny. I don't want to be locked out if you're ever in the hospital." Every time, it had sounded like love. I'd told her I'd think about it. I never had. And then the last real conversation I ever had with my father, 10 days before he died, thin and tired but still sharp behind the eyes. I'd stopped by with lunch, and as I was leaving, he'd grabbed my wrist, his grip still strong even then, and said, "Don't sign anything with her lawyer friend till I've looked at it." I'd assumed he was confused. Rachel didn't have a lawyer friend as far as I knew. I'd chalked it up to medication and kissed his forehead and told him to rest. Lying awake beside my sleeping wife that night, I understood for the first time that my father hadn't been confused at all. I got up before dawn, made coffee I didn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table with the 2 business cards from the safe lined up in front of me. Teresa Voss, Private Investigations. And beneath her name, printed small, a line I hadn't noticed the night before. Financial Fraud and Asset Investigations, licensed, Maricopa County. Not a divorce investigator, not someone you hire to catch a spouse in a motel parking lot. Financial fraud. My father hadn't been worried about Rachel's heart. He'd been worried about our money. I dialed the number on the card at 6:15 that morning, my hand steadier than I expected. It rang twice. A woman's voice answered, careful, unhurried, the voice of someone who'd learned not to give anything away for free. Voss Investigations. I opened my mouth, and for a second, nothing came out. Then I said the only thing I could think to say. "My name is Daniel Cole. My father was Walter Cole. I think he hired you." There was a pause long enough that I thought the call had dropped. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, softer, but more alert, like she'd been waiting for this call for weeks and hadn't been sure it would come. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Mr. Cole," she said. "I read about your father's passing. I wondered if anyone would find what he left." The words sat in my chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples still moving outward long after I'd hung up the phone. Teresa Voss wouldn't say much more over the phone. She was careful in a way that felt professional rather than evasive.
"I need to confirm a few things first," she said. "Your identity, that your father's passed, that you're actually the son and not someone else who found those cards."
It struck me as strange until I realized. Of course. If what was in that safe was as serious as it looked, she'd have thought about the possibility that someone else might come looking for it too. Someone who'd want it to disappear. I met her 2 days later at a diner off the interstate. The kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that had been sitting too long. Chosen, I suspected, because it was public but unremarkable. Nobody we knew would be there. She was younger than I'd pictured from her voice, maybe 45, sharp-eyed, dressed like she could disappear into any office building in the city without anyone remembering her face. She had a folder with her, thick, and she kept her hand resting on top of it for a long moment before she opened it, like she was deciding how much I could handle at once. "Your father hired me 8 months ago," she said. "He came to my office alone, didn't tell me much about why at first. Just wanted background financial monitoring on your wife. Where she was going, who she was meeting, what accounts she was accessing." I felt something twist low in my stomach. "You mean he thought she was having an affair?" Teresa shook her head, and something in her expression, not quite pity but close to it, told me the truth was going to be worse than that. "No, Mr. Cole. He was very specific about that from the first meeting. He told me, and I remember this because it was unusual phrasing, 'I don't care if she's sleeping with someone. I need to know if she's moving money.'" She slid the folder an inch closer but didn't open it yet. "The man in those photographs isn't your wife's lover. His name is Grant Hollis. He's a freelance accountant, does contract work for small and mid-sized companies around the valley." "I've seen this pattern before," she added, her voice flattening into something more clinical. "Financial coaching that runs parallel to a marriage. The spouse gets coached, sometimes literally, on how to manage the target. Stay warm, stay patient, never confrontational. In my notes from an old case, I used to write it as shorthand, 'Keep tone supportive.' It's not affection, it's technique." "An accountant," I repeated, like saying it slowly might make it make sense. "Coached. Your father believed Mrs. Cole was building a financial relationship with someone who had access to move and disguise money, someone with the professional skill to make transfers look routine." I confirmed the connection. What I haven't fully confirmed yet is the scope or the target. She paused. "But I have a theory, and your father had the same one before he died." "Which is?" Teresa looked at me for a moment before she answered, like she wanted to make sure I was steady enough for it. "Your father didn't think this was about leaving you, Daniel. If it were just an affair, or even just a divorce play, this would look different. Bank statements, real estate research, a lawyer's letterhead. What he was seeing was something more patient than that." She tapped the folder once gently. "Your father wasn't worried about her leaving you. He was worried about what happens after you're gone, or incapacitated." The word landed strange in my ears. Incapacitated. Not a word people use casually. Not a word my father would have chosen without meaning something specific by it. "I don't understand," I said, though some small, cold part of me already did. "I don't have the full picture yet," Teresa said. "Your father was gathering evidence, not conclusions. He wanted proof before he said anything to you, because he told me, and I wrote this down because it stuck with me. If I go to my son with a suspicion and no proof, he'll defend her, and I'll lose him too." I sat with that for a long moment, the diner noise fading into background static. My father hadn't said anything to me not because he didn't trust me, but because he trusted me completely. Enough to know exactly how I'd react to an accusation without evidence. He'd been protecting the relationship between us even while trying to protect me from something else entirely.
There's a meeting,
Teresa said, closing the folder now, watching my face carefully.
between your wife and Grant Hollis, Thursday. I've been tracking a pattern. They meet roughly every 10 days, always somewhere quiet, always with paperwork changing hands. If you want to understand what your father was trying to show you, I think you need to see it yourself, not through photographs, in person.
I looked down at my hands wrapped around a coffee cup I hadn't touched, and I thought about my father sitting in this same kind of booth, maybe this very one, 8 months ago, alone, starting something he wasn't sure he'd live to finish. "Okay," I said. "Thursday. I'll be there." Teresa nodded slowly, like she'd expected that answer and respected it. As she gathered her things to leave, she paused, half standing, and looked at me with an expression somewhere between warning and something gentler.
Mr. Cole,
She said,
whatever you see Thursday, I need you to promise me you won't react in the moment. Your father spent 8 months building patience into this. Don't spend it in 30 seconds.
I drove home from that diner with the word incapacitated lodged somewhere behind my sternum, and by the time I pulled into our driveway, I understood exactly why my father had chosen it. 8 months ago. The same window Teresa said my father had hired her. I'd had a fainting spell at the warehouse. Nothing dramatic in the end. Dehydration combined with a blood pressure medication my doctor later adjusted. But at the time, nobody knew that. I'd gone down hard enough to split my eyebrow, and Rachel had ridden with me in the ambulance, gripping my hand so tight I could still remember the shape of her rings pressing into my fingers. It had scared all of us. It was in the weeks after, once the doctors cleared me, that Rachel became insistent about something I'd read at the time as simple prudence. "We need to get your affairs in order, Danny. A medical power of attorney," she said. "Standard, something any responsible couple our age should have." I remembered a draft appearing on the kitchen counter one evening. Remembered flipping through it distractedly, telling myself I'd sit down properly with it that weekend. I never had. I hadn't thought about that document in months. I went straight to my home office that night, Rachel out at a book club she attended every other Thursday, a detail that sat differently in my mind now, and pulled open the file drawer where I kept anything important. The folder was right where I'd left it, or so I thought. I opened it, expecting the unsigned draft I remembered, my old notes still in the margins. Instead, I found a completed version, signed, notarized, dated 4 months ago, a date I had no memory of at all. The signature at the bottom was mine, or close enough that I couldn't say with certainty it wasn't. My hands had been shaking a little back then, still adjusting to new medication. It would have been easy to slide a page in front of me during some other stack of paperwork and let my exhausted, trusting hand do the rest. The document named Rachel as my sole medical decision-maker. No secondary contact, no requirement for a second physician's opinion. And buried near the bottom, in language dense enough that I'd have needed a lawyer beside me to catch it the first time, full authority over my financial affairs necessary for my ongoing care and the maintenance of jointly held assets. I read it twice, then set it down flat on the desk. The fainting spell. My father quietly hiring an investigator who specialized in fraud, not infidelity. A document appearing 4 months later with my signature on it that I had no memory of giving. The timing lined up too cleanly to be anything but deliberate. I called Teresa back that night and told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, there was no surprise in her voice, only grim confirmation. "That matches what your father suspected," she said. "There's a meeting between your wife and Grant Hollis scheduled for Thursday. If you want the truth, your father spent his last months trying to hand you. You need to be there in person." "Thursday," I said. "Tell me where." Thursday arrived the way dreaded things always do. too slowly in the days leading up to it, and then, somehow, all at once. Teresa picked the location, a strip mall coffee shop on the east side of town with a parking lot that gave a clear line of sight to a corner booth through the front window, and a second unmarked car she'd already positioned across the street before I arrived. She'd told me to park 2 lots over, walk in separately, sit near the back where I could see without being seen. "You're not there to confront anyone today," she reminded me on the phone that morning, her voice even, deliberate. "You're there to understand what you're confronting." I got there 20 minutes early. I ordered a coffee I didn't want and sat with my back to the wall, the way I imagined my father might have sat if he'd ever done this himself, watching the door. Rachel arrived at 2:47, alone, wearing the gray cardigan she'd bought for a work event 2 winters ago, her hair pulled back the way she wore it when she wanted to look put together but not dressed up. She checked her phone once, twice, glanced toward the door, and I watched my wife of 21 years scan a room for a man who wasn't me, with the practiced casualness of someone who'd done this many times before. Grant Hollis walked in 6 minutes later. Mid-50s, unremarkable in the specific way that made him good at his job, I imagined. The kind of face that didn't stick in memory. A gray blazer, a leather folio under one arm. He slid into the booth across from Rachel, and there was no embrace, no lingering touch, nothing that read as romantic. It was worse than that, somehow. It was businesslike, comfortable, practiced. I couldn't hear their conversation from where I sat, but I didn't need to. Teresa had a directional microphone running from a bag on the table beside her, feeding audio to an earpiece. And after a few minutes, she leaned toward me slightly and murmured just enough for me to follow the shape of it. Grant was talking about the transition window, about the trust structure being ready to activate, about making sure the accountant of record change goes through before the fiscal quarter closes, so there's no red flag for the outside auditor. Rachel nodded along to all of it, asked a clarifying question about signature requirements, and said something that made my stomach drop clean through the floor of that coffee shop. "As long as I have medical authority in place, the financial piece follows automatically. That's what my lawyer confirmed." My lawyer. Not our lawyer. A lawyer I had never met, never been told about, never signed a single engagement letter with. And yet somewhere in this city, someone had apparently been drafting documents on my behalf, or at least around the edges of my life, for months. Teresa slid a folder across the table to me without a word, and I opened it there in that booth, my hands steadier than they had any right to be. Bank statements. Vendor invoices from our company, 3 of them for a supplier I didn't recognize. Meridian Fabrication Supply. Each one for amounts just under the threshold that would have triggered a second signature requirement under our company's own internal policy, a policy my father had insisted on years ago and that I'd never once questioned. Payments totaling just over $340,000 over the past year, routed to an account that, according to a state business registry printout stapled behind the invoices, had been opened by Grant Hollis 6 weeks after my fainting spell at the warehouse. Falsified vendor invoices, a shell payee. Timed almost to the week with the medical power of attorney that would have handed Rachel, and by extension apparently Grant, full authority over the company's finances the moment I was declared incapacitated, whether by accident, illness, or something engineered to look like either. I sat there with my father's suspicions laid out in black and white in front of me. And grief did something strange in that moment. It didn't disappear, but it transformed, cooling from something that had been sitting heavy and formless in my chest for 3 weeks into something with edges. Something I could use. I thought about my father sitting somewhere, maybe this very coffee shop, alone, 8 months earlier, piecing together exactly this, dying with the knowledge that his son's marriage and his son's company were both quietly, patiently being hollowed out from the inside, and choosing, with whatever strength he had left, to spend it building proof instead of raising an alarm he knew I wouldn't have believed. Always keep your name on everything, son. Not paranoia. A shield he'd been building for me since before I understood I'd need one. Across the coffee shop, Rachel laughed softly at something Grant said and reached over to squeeze his forearm briefly, the same easy, familiar gesture she used with me 100 times a week. The gesture of someone completely, comfortably at home in a deception. I didn't stand up. I didn't cross the room. Teresa had been right to warn me because every part of me wanted to. Instead, I closed the folder, my hands finally beginning to tremble now that the shock had somewhere to go, and I turned to her. "How do I make sure this ends completely?" I asked, my voice quieter than I expected it to be. Not just quietly. Not just a conversation in a coffee shop where they get to walk away and try again somewhere else. Completely. Teresa looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that measures whether a person is asking out of anger or out of resolve. And something in my face must have answered the question for her, because she nodded slowly and reached for her phone. "Your father already retained someone for exactly this," she said. "A business attorney. I have his number. I think it's time you called him." The attorney's name was Arthur Bellamy, and when I called him that Thursday evening, he answered on the first ring like he'd been waiting for this exact call for weeks, which, it turned out, he had. "Your father came to see me 9 months ago," he told me, his voice low and unhurried. "He didn't want to alarm you without proof. He asked me to prepare everything so that if the day came, you could move fast and move clean. I have to be honest with you, Mr. Cole. I didn't expect to be having this conversation with him gone. It took 11 days to put everything in place. Arthur worked with our company's board, 3 longtime members who'd known my father for decades, to schedule what looked, on paper, like a routine ownership transition meeting. Rachel had been expecting exactly this kind of meeting for months. Teresa's surveillance had picked up references to it in at least 2 conversations with Grant. As far as Rachel knew, this was the moment everything she'd been quietly building toward would finally formalize. She arrived dressed the way she always dressed for anything she considered important. Sharp, composed, a woman who'd clearly rehearsed this moment. Grant was there too, invited under the pretense that the board wanted to formally onboard the new accountant of record. He shook my hand when he walked in. I shook his back. Neither of us let anything show. Arthur sat to my left. Teresa sat near the back, a folder in her lap she wouldn't open unless needed. The 3 board members sat across the table, faces carefully neutral, though I could see the tightness in Ed Sarkeesian's jaw. I let Rachel and Grant talk first. Streamlining financial oversight, modernizing the accounting relationship. Rachel glanced at me periodically with warm, patient confidence, the same expression she'd worn across 100 kitchen table conversations about my affairs. I recognized it now for what it was. Teresa had a name for it. Keep tone supportive, a technique, not a feeling. And I'd spent months mistaking one for the other. When they finished, I set a folder on the table, unopened. "There's something the board needs to see before we move forward. And I think, Rachel, you already know what's in it." I opened it and laid out the invoices, the shell account, the medical power of attorney with a signature I had no memory of giving. Arthur spoke the necessary legal language beside me: falsification of business records, a fraudulently obtained power of attorney, coordinated diversion of company funds. Grant's composure broke first. "I think we should discuss this without the full board present," he said, already half rising from his chair, reaching for the folio at his elbow like he might still salvage something by walking out with paperwork of his own. "Sit down, Mr. Hollis," Ed Sarkeesian said, not raising his voice, and something in the flatness of it made Grant actually stop. "We're discussing it right here." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one of the other board members, a quieter man named Phil who'd said almost nothing until now, leaned forward and asked the question I'd been dreading. Daniel, how do we know these bank records are authentic and not something assembled after the fact? No offense to your investigator, but this is a serious accusation to bring in front of a client and a fellow board member. The room went very still. It was a fair question, and for a second I felt the whole meeting balance on a blade's edge. The possibility that composure alone might not be enough. Teresa didn't wait for me to answer. She stood, opened her own folder, and slid a set of certified bank statements across the table, stamped and sourced directly from the financial institution, alongside her licensed investigator's report. These are original records, subpoenaed through my licensing authority, not reconstructions, she said evenly. I'd encourage the board to have its own counsel verify them independently before this meeting ends. I don't expect you to take my word for it. Phil looked through the pages for a long moment, then nodded slowly and sat back. The tension in the room didn't vanish, but it shifted, settled into something more solid, more certain. Rachel hadn't said a word through any of it. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost the warmth I'd heard directed at me across 2 decades of dinner tables. You went through his things, she said, looking at me. Not a question. My father's things, I said. He left them for me. I think some part of him knew you'd try this eventually, even if I didn't. Arthur laid out the board's terms: full cooperation, immediate return of diverted funds, resignation from any financial authority tied to me or the company, in exchange for the board declining to pursue criminal referral through the company itself, though nothing would stop a personal filing if I chose to make one. Grant was terminated on the spot, his access revoked before he left the building, a referral for prosecution already in motion through Teresa's documentation. Rachel sat very still through all of it. When the board finally excused themselves to give us a moment, she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in 21 years of marriage. Something almost like respect, buried under the wreckage of everything else. How did you find out? She asked quietly. I thought about my father, bolting a safe into the concrete of his garage, hiring an investigator he never got to see finish her work, sitting across a lawyer's desk while he was dying, spending what little strength he had left, building a shield for a son who hadn't even known he needed one. My father never trusted you, I said, and it turns out I'm learning that too late to thank him for it. That was the smartest thing he ever taught me. 3 months passed before I let myself go back into that garage. The divorce was finalized quietly, faster than I expected once the evidence was on the table. Rachel's attorney, once he understood what Arthur had assembled, advised her not to fight it, and she didn't. Grant Hollis was formally charged with fraud and embezzlement. The last I heard, his case was still working through the courts, and the diverted funds, or most of them, had been recovered through the civil judgment Arthur helped the board pursue. The company was mine now, fully, cleanly, my name the only one on any document that mattered, exactly the way my father had always told me to keep it, long before I understood why. I hadn't expected the ache to soften as quickly as it did. Grief for a marriage that turned out to be built on something false moves differently than I thought it would. Less like heartbreak and more like recalibration. The slow work of learning to trust your own memory of 21 years, while also accepting that some of it had never been what it looked like. The garage still smelled the way it always had: motor oil, sawdust, the particular mustiness that no amount of time seemed to lift. I'd cleared most of it out weeks earlier, enough to find the safe, enough to box up the tools I didn't need. But I'd never gone through it properly, the way you clean a house when you're finally ready to leave it behind instead of just passing through it. That Saturday, I decided to finish the job right. Not just clear the surfaces, move the workbench off the wall, sweep behind it, check every seam my father might have used. It was there, on my knees, behind the bench with a flashlight, that I found it. An envelope taped to the underside, tucked into the corner where the bench met the wall stud. Positioned so low and so far back that I'd never have seen it standing up, never have felt it just running a hand along the surface. My father hadn't hidden it carelessly. He'd hidden it the way he did everything, deliberately, for someone who was willing to get on the floor and look properly, not someone in a hurry to be done. I understood, kneeling there, why I hadn't found it the first time. I hadn't been ready yet to look that closely at anything. My name was on the front, in handwriting steadier than I remembered from those final months. Inside was a letter, dated almost a year before he died. Danny, if you're reading this, it means you found the safe, and it means I didn't get the chance to tell you all this myself, which I'm sorry for. I want you to understand something. I didn't say anything sooner, because a father telling his son, "I think your wife is stealing from you," without proof, does one thing and one thing only. It makes the son defend her, and it costs him his father in the process. I wasn't willing to lose you over a suspicion, so I decided to get you something better than a suspicion. I decided to get you the truth, built carefully enough that you'd have to believe it, even from a man who might not be around to say it out loud. I know this isn't how you wanted to hear any of it. I know it probably feels like I chose evidence over honesty over years, when I could have just asked you to look closer, sooner. Maybe I was wrong about that. But I've never been much good at telling people what's in my chest, Danny. This was the only way I knew how to say it. I love you. I always have. And I wasn't going to let anyone take from you what I spent my whole life building for you to have. Dad. I sat on the concrete floor for a long time, the letter in my hands, the garage quiet around me. And for the first time since the funeral, the grief and the gratitude arrived together, instead of taking turns. If you've listened this far, I want to say something to you directly, the way my father never quite managed to say things to me until it was almost too late. Pay attention to the quiet ones in your life, the people who show love through preparation instead of declarations, through showing up instead of speaking up. And pay attention, too, to anyone who gets a little too eager to get your affairs in order, who wraps control in the language of care. Sometimes the people trying to protect you are the ones saying the least. And sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones you should be watching the closest. If this story meant something to you tonight, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what you'd have done in Daniel's place. And if you want more stories like this one, about the quiet ways we protect the people we love and the quiet ways we are sometimes betrayed by them, stay close. I'll see you in the next one.